CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 2, Part 10, Audio by Renee Matthew. Now we have to take a look at the details of transhumance. Transhumance is the herdsman regular annual movement. They can move from one place to another in a particular year between the higher mountain regions and low-lying ground, and that was in search of pasture for sheep and other flocks. So search for pasture, that is the most important requirement of these kind of people moving from one place to another. In Spain, the north was much less developed and inhabited largely by Celtic-speaking peasantry. We saw that Celtic was highly promoted in Spain, but it lost its influence in the first century itself. So the northern part of Spain was less developed, and it was largely inhabited by Celtic-speaking people that lived in hilltop villages, which is known as Castella. Castella, this is the picture of Castella, hilltop villages in Spain. And it was inhabited by the Celtic-speaking peasantry. Now, when we think of the Roman Empire, we should not forget these differences. This is something which was different in the Roman Empire from the Iranian Empire. What about the water power? Water power is very important, which decides the economic power of a particular place. In this ancient world, we cannot say that people were backward or primitive, because water power nowadays, this is from a modern technology that I've put the picture, but this was not maybe prominent in those days as far as the Roman Empire, but of course they were sure of these kind of structures much better than us. So we cannot say that they did not grow culturally and economically and they were backward and primitive. It is not like that. Of course, they were intelligent. Intellectual standard was very high for them. Application of water power around the Mediterranean was the only choice that they had. It had advanced water-powered milling technology also. Diversified application was there, which showed that the technology was progressing, or it was reaching a particular point of progression in those days. So that was the status of the water power in the Roman Empire. Hydraulic mining techniques were prominent from those days itself. The use of hydraulic mining technique in the Spanish gold and silver mines largely made use of the hydraulic mining technique, and the gigantic industrial scale on which these mines utilize the water power. It was widely seen in the 2nd century. So, hydraulic mining techniques were used in the Spanish gold and silver mines. So, very important point there. So, what did they do? The existence of well-organized commercial and banking networks were seen. Well-organized commercial and banking networks. So, it was very well organized. We saw all the factors which put the Roman Empire as a unified nation, right? So organization is very important, and more than that, the commercial and banking networks. The widespread use of money. They had a track on how the money was used and where and when it was actually taken up. And all these indications show that we cannot underestimate the Roman Empire at all. We tend to underestimate the sophistication, but still, it played a great deal in the development and progress of this great empire. Now we have to go into one of the most important part of the section of this particular chapter, and that is slavery. Yes, slavery was there in Roman Empire also. I've put 2 pictures of how the slaves were treated. It was tearing, the way it was torn, the way the people were torn apart, and sometimes I feel that the people in the olden days, they were more tolerant. It is not that you have to tolerate all this cruelty, but they were mentally strong to face all these things. Nowadays, we don't find people like that, and of course, the pressure that we have nowadays is more high. So, issues of labor was very high, and of course, use of slavery was also there. It was a kind of institution which existed in the Roman Empire, and it is deeply rooted in the ancient world. We don't have slavery now in the public sphere or in the commercial sphere, but then slavery was commercialized. Like how the Africans were transported like goods. Yes, the same thing happened here. and both in the Mediterranean and in the Near East. These two places use slavery to a very high great deal. Not even Christianity, which emerged in those days, Christianity is against slavery, it is against dominance of another human being. But it was not able to do anything in those days. Very difficult for all that. So slavery existed as an institution. It was a prominent thing which happened or occurred in the Mediterranean and the Near East. More than institution, it was a normal thing, a part of life actually. That was how people took slavery. Now, a little more on the slavery that we are going to talk about. It does not follow that the bulk of the labor in the Roman economy was performed by slaves. Much of the labor was not done by the slaves. We may mistake it that way, where all the work in the Roman Empire was done by the slaves. It is not like that. Everybody had to work. And of course, slavery was used in Mediterranean and the Near Eastern parts of the Roman Empire, but it was largely used in Italy in the Republican period. But it is not true of the empire as a whole. Slaves were like an investment, like how you invest in gold and other kind of commodities. It is like slave was an investment, and at least one Roman agricultural writer advised landowners against using them actually. Many of them were not for it. Many people said we shouldn't go for the slavery investment. And many writers, agricultural writers, they did not encourage the use of slavery. They were writing against that. For example, especially for harvest and all these things, slaves will be facing a lot of problems. They tried to convince the owners, but they were not successful. For example, during the harvest, their health could be really damaged. It will be very much affected. They will face a threat. For example, malaria. Malaria did not have a cure in those days. Very difficult to deal with it. And it was not because of sympathy that the writers were writing against it. It is because of the hard economic calculation. Because using the trade and investing in the trade was like a very big thing for them. They had to spend so much of money. And look at the nobles or the wealthiest part of the Roman Empire. This is how they dressed and how they carried themselves. On the other hand, if the Roman upper classes were often brutal towards their slaves, ordinary people showed some kind of compassion. The upper classes were always brutal towards the slave. They did not have any gap to show humanity there. But ordinary people showed some compassion towards the slaves. Now when we talk about warfare was less widespread. And of course, there was peace in the Roman Empire when you compare it with the other parts of the world. In spite of all these kind of happiness, the economy was stable. We can say that culturally they were like intermixed, but still some stability was there. They enjoyed peace. The civilians enjoyed some kind of peace. The supply of slaves gradually declined because everybody was not supporting it, and it declined. Users of slave labor had to turn either to slave breeding, that is, they will buy human beings, and like how you breed sheep or cattle, you have to breed humans. They will buy people who were not of high poverty line, and they will breed the slave by giving food and everything, and they will use them. Or to cheaper substitutes such as wage labor, which was more easily dispensable. Like wage labor means they will pay the people who actually work instead of slave labor. The difference between slave and the wage labor is slavery means you have complete control and authority over the person. Wage labor means you will ask the person to work and after that you pay the person. That is what happens. In fact, free labor was extensively used on public works at Rome. Free labor where they were not paid. Extensively slave labor was used in public works, and that is why we have all these great architecture. Have you ever wondered how Rome has got great wealth of architecture and buildings, even Mesopotamia? It was because of the labor, because of the people, the way they toiled. It would have been really expensive if they really had slave labor. Slave labor was more expensive than the wage labor. Okay, so free labor was employed instead of slave labor towards the end of the 2nd century and so on. Unlike hired workers means you have to definitely pay them by the end of the day. Not only them, there will be agents who supply these workers. So, apart from these hired workers, just now I told you that slave labor was more expensive. In what way was it expensive? And here also there's another line which is given, that cheaper substitute included wage labor, which was more dispensable. It was more profitable. Now slaves, the problem with the slave labor is they had to be fed and maintained, like breeding, throughout the year. It is like the people who made use of slave labor will have to be totally responsible for these slaves. They will have to maintain their health, feed them, maintain, all these things will have to happen. And that increase the cost of holding this kind of labor. It is like total responsibility. You have to take care of the whole lot just like that. Total responsibility and authority also under the person who owned them. This is probably why slaves are not widely found in the agriculture of the later period. So slaves declined because of the kind of demand that they had. It was not found in the agriculture, at least not in the eastern provinces. So it started declining gradually. Now they and freedmen, that is slaves who had been set free by their masters. Some people were freed by their masters because they were not able to hold them. So freedmen were extensively used as business managers, where obviously they were not required in large numbers. So many people did not require slaves in large numbers, so they just freed them. And they were extensively used as business managers, where obviously they were not able to keep them in large numbers. So this particular portion of the text is very important because you will be asked to write short answers and many questions can be expected from this particular portion. Now, masters often gave their slaves or freedmen. You know what is the meaning of freedmen by now? Okay. Slaves or freedmen capital to run businesses. So what they will do is, like, for a long period of time, just imagine you're under the control of a very wealthy person. The person is breeding you for slavery, giving you enough food, maintaining you, and is totally responsible for your health. Suddenly the master tells you, okay, fine, now you please go, you're a free man. What will you do? You will say, how will I be paid? How will I live? So what did the masters do? They will give a portion of their share, a little bit of capital or money for them to run businesses on their behalf or even businesses of their own. Okay, so that was the condition. So that is why it is written as they transformed themselves from freedmen to business managers. So that was a transformation of the slaves. So they could run business on the behalf of the masters or the managers, or they can run businesses of their own. So this was the kind of culture which showed slavery and how the wealthy people dressed and how they were carrying themselves around. Now there were Roman agricultural writers who wrote against the slaves. I told you that earlier. They paid a great deal of attention to the management of labor, how they managed this labor. There was a 1st century writer, his name was Columella. This is the writer, his name is Columella. He came from the south of Spain and recommended that landowners should keep these things. The way you manage labor is very important. Even now we can see institutions which do not manage or do not give good working conditions for the laborers, which is not right. So, Columella said that you have to do all these 3 things to manage the labor. One thing is you have to keep a reserve stock of implements and tools. The implements and tools used by these people to work, a reserve stock of all these things. Twice as many as they needed. More than what was needed had to be kept, because stock should be there. They shouldn't say we don't have the equipments. So that production could be continued. You may ask, why do you have to keep tools that was not actually required? Why more tools? Because the production had to be continuous. For the laws in slave labor time exceeds the cost of such items. So when there was a loss, they can have much in stock. They don't have to actually go and fetch the items anymore. So they could have a reserve stock of all these implements and tools, so that if there was a loss, it would exceed the cost of such items. And when they were not able to purchase such kind of items during the laws, if that was the condition, they can take it from their stock. Did you understand? Suddenly there will be a loss and the masters or the businessmen will not be able to purchase new items when there was a need. So they can take it from their stock. So that was the kind of a guideline which was given by Columella, the 1st century writer. And many of them followed that, and they found that they were also successful in doing it. Okay, so that was the most important part of this particular writer.